Edit: the hardest goodbyes are the ones disguised as ordinary days. The knock on my apartment door came at exactly 11:52 on a quiet Sunday night, just as I was rinsing the last coffee mug before heading to bed. Nobody ever visited without texting first, especially not in my neighborhood outside Portland, where life followed such predictable routines that even the mail carrier waved at the same time every morning. I frowned, dried my hands, and walked toward the door. Through the peephole, I saw a familiar face standing beneath the dim hallway light. Noah Brooks, my best friend for nearly 10 years. He stood there with a single navy suitcase resting beside his feet, his olive green jacket still damp from the light rain outside. His dark brown hair had been pushed back by the wind, and although he wore the same easy smile I had known since college, something about it looked different tonight. It reached his lips, but never quite reached his eyes. I unlocked the door without thinking. "Noah, what are you doing here?" He looked at me for a long second before quietly asking, "Can I stay with you for 1 week?" That was it. No explanation. No long story. No excuse about apartment repairs or family emergencies. Just one simple question that somehow carried far more weight than it should have. Of course, I answered almost immediately, stepping aside so he could come in. We had shared tiny dorm rooms, survived impossible final exams, moved each other between apartments more times than I could count, and celebrated nearly every important milestone together. If Noah needed a place to stay, my door would always be open. He thanked me with a small nod before rolling his suitcase across the hardwood floor. The apartment suddenly felt fuller, though I could not explain why. It was only a one-bedroom apartment with a small guest room that usually doubled as my office, but Noah somehow made every room feel warmer simply by being there. While I made fresh coffee, he quietly removed his jacket and looked around the apartment with slow, careful eyes. His attention lingered on the framed photographs near the bookshelf, the little fern growing beside the window, and the coffee table. We had assembled together years ago after buying it from a neighborhood thrift store for $30. It almost seemed as though he was seeing everything for the very first time, or perhaps for what he believed might be the last. "You have done a lot with this place," he said softly. "It finally feels like home." I smiled. It took long enough. We carried our mugs to the living room and talked about the ordinary things people who had known each other forever usually talked about. My architecture projects, his recent workload, the rainy Oregon weather, a new bakery that had opened 3 blocks away. Everything sounded completely normal, yet every now and then I caught Noah watching me with an expression that disappeared the moment I looked back. It was not uncomfort. Monday morning arrived wrapped in soft gray clouds and the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifting through the apartment. I expected to wake up before Noah, but as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I found him standing at the stove making pancakes as though he had lived there for years instead of one night. He glanced over his shoulder with an easy smile. "I found the pancake mix in your cabinet. I hope you do not mind." I laughed. "You still remember where I keep everything?" He shrugged with quiet confidence. "Some things are easy to remember." We ate breakfast while the local news reported another week of steady rain across western Oregon. The conversation felt comfortable, almost identical to the countless mornings we had shared during college vacations. We talked about my latest architecture project, a bookstore renovation downtown, and he listened with the same attention he always had, asking questions about details I barely remembered mentioning months earlier. He knew the names of my coworkers, remembered which coffee blend I always bought, and even asked whether the elderly woman across the hall still left homemade cookies outside her apartment every Christmas. His memory amazed me. It was as though pieces of my everyday life mattered to him just as much as his own. After breakfast, I left for work, promising I would be home before 6. The entire drive downtown, I found myself thinking about the words written on the whiteboard. Day 1. Something about them refused to leave my mind. Work should have distracted me, but every time I paused between meetings, I caught myself wondering why Noah had asked for exactly 1 week. Not 5 days. Not until he figured something out. Exactly 1 week. When I finally returned home that evening, I immediately noticed something had changed. The cabinet door that had squeaked for months opened silently. The loose handle on the balcony door no longer rattled when I slid it open. Even the small fern beside the window looked healthier, sitting in fresh soil inside a clean ceramic pot. Noah looked up from the couch, where he was reading one of my old travel books. "I hope you are not upset," he said. I got a little restless. I shook my head, smiling despite my surprise. You spent your whole day fixing my apartment? Not the whole day, he answered with a quiet laugh. Just the parts that looked like they had been waiting for someone to notice. His answer sounded simple, yet there was something unusually thoughtful behind it. Later we walked to the neighborhood grocery store, less than a mile away, carrying reusable shopping bags through quiet streets lined with maple trees beginning to turn orange. Noah stopped to admire flower boxes outside a small bakery and smiled at a golden retriever that insisted on greeting every person it passed. He seemed unusually aware of every little detail around him, almost as though he wanted to remember the neighborhood forever. On the way home, we passed a tiny independent bookstore we used to visit whenever he came into town. Noah slowed his steps and looked through the front window for several long seconds. "Do you remember the first book you ever recommended to me?" he asked. I frowned, searching my memory. "Honestly, I do not." He smiled softly, though a trace of sadness flickered across his face before disappearing. "That sounds about right." After dinner, I finished washing the dishes while Noah quietly walked over to the whiteboard beside the refrigerator. He picked up the same black marker, drew a careful line beneath the first entry, and wrote 2 more words. Day 2. I leaned against the counter. "You really are committed to this countdown." He placed the cap back onto the marker without looking at me. "Sometimes seeing the days reminds you not to waste them." "What happens after day 7? I asked. He stood completely still for a moment before offering the smallest smile. "You will know." Then he wished me good night and disappeared into the guest room, leaving me alone in the kitchen staring at the growing countdown, realizing that every ordinary conversation with my best friend now seemed to hide a question I had not yet learned how to ask. Tuesday arrived with clear skies for the first time that week, and Noah surprised me by suggesting we spend the afternoon together after I finished work instead of staying inside the apartment. "There is a place I want to visit," he said over breakfast while pouring orange juice into 2 glasses. "You probably have not been there in a while." I smiled. "You are making it sound mysterious." He only laughed and changed the subject. The entire day at the office passed more slowly than usual. Every now and then I found myself thinking about the whiteboard in my kitchen, wondering what day 3 would bring. When I finally pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment that evening, Noah was already waiting on the front steps with 2 paper cups of coffee from the neighborhood cafe we had visited countless times over the years. "I remembered your order," he said, handing me the cup before we started walking. That was never difficult. We followed quiet streets toward the old Riverside Park where we had spent so many weekends during college whenever life became overwhelming. The walking trail looked almost exactly the same. The wooden benches had been replaced, a few younger trees had grown taller, but the river still reflected the fading sunlight with the same peaceful rhythm I remembered. We sat together without speaking for several minutes, listening to ducks glide across the water while children laughed somewhere farther down the trail. Finally, Noah broke the silence. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" I searched my memory before shaking my head with an embarrassed smile. "Not really. I know we came here a lot." Noah looked out across the river. "It was after your first presentation at school. You thought you had completely embarrassed yourself." I laughed. "That sounds like me. You bought 2 hot dogs from a food truck because you said bad days deserved better dinners." I blinked. "I actually said that. Word for word." He smiled softly. "You also told me that if either of us ever became successful, we should promise never to become too busy for the people who mattered." His voice carried a quiet warmth that made the memory feel strangely important even though I could not remember saying any of it. As we continued walking through the park, Noah pointed toward an old footbridge. "That is where you convinced me to apply for my first internship." A few minutes later, he gestured toward a small ice cream stand. "You dropped your entire cone right there and insisted it was the universe reminding you not to celebrate too early." Every place seemed connected to another story that Noah remembered in perfect detail. I realized that while I had been busy chasing the future, he had somehow preserved pieces of our past that I had unknowingly left behind. On our way home, we stopped at the independent bookstore we had passed the night before. The owner greeted Noah with immediate recognition, smiling as though an old friend had returned after many years. While I wandered through the history section, Noah quietly disappeared toward the back shelves. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a worn paperback with a faded blue cover. "Open it," he said. Curious, I turned to the first page and immediately recognized my own handwriting dated almost 10 years earlier. Read this whenever life feels impossible. You always have someone in your corner. Ethan. I stared at the page in disbelief. I wrote this. Noah nodded. You gave it to me before my final exams. I searched my memory again, but found nothing. I cannot believe I forgot. He gently smiled. I never did. We walked home beneath the orange glow of the streetlights, neither of us speaking very much. The silence felt comfortable, yet my thoughts refused to slow down. When we stepped into the apartment, Noah quietly picked up the black marker and walked to the whiteboard beside the refrigerator. Beneath day 3, he carefully wrote a single sentence before placing the marker back on the tray. Some memories never fade because they quietly become part of who we are. I stood there reading those words while Noah disappeared onto the balcony to watch the sunset alone. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether the greatest story of our friendship had been unfolding right in front of me all these years without me ever truly seeing it. Wednesday slipped into our routine so naturally that it almost felt as though Noah had always lived there. I woke to the smell of fresh coffee again. Only this time he was standing on the balcony watering the little fern that had somehow become greener since he arrived. The morning sunlight reflected across the apartment windows while the city slowly came to life below. You really saved that plant, I joked as I stepped outside with my coffee. Noah smiled without taking his eyes off the leaves. Sometimes things only need someone to notice they are struggling. His answer sounded simple, but for some reason it stayed with me the entire drive to work. That afternoon, my manager asked whether I wanted to stay late to review a new project, but I declined for the first time in months. I could not explain why, yet every part of me wanted to get home before sunset. When I unlocked my apartment door, I immediately noticed another quiet change. The bookshelf near the living room window had been completely reorganized. My travel journals stood neatly beside old photo albums, and the worn paperback Noah had shown me the day before rested carefully on the center shelf. Nearby, the loose picture frame that had leaned crooked for almost a year now hung perfectly straight. Noah looked up from the dining table, where he was polishing 2 old coffee mugs we had bought during our senior year of college. I hope I did not move anything important, he said. I slowly looked around the room. You keep making this place feel more like home than I ever managed. He lowered his eyes and smiled to himself. Homes deserve to be cared for. Later that evening, we ordered barbecue from the little restaurant a few blocks away and ate while an old baseball game played quietly on television. Noah seemed unusually relaxed, laughing at stories we had told each other dozens of times before. Then, without warning, he asked, if someone disappeared from your everyday life tomorrow, what would you miss first? I frowned. That is a strange question. Maybe. He took another bite before looking back at me. What would it be? I thought for a moment before answering honestly. Probably the little things. Random conversations. Knowing someone is only one phone call away. Noah nodded almost imperceptibly, as though my answer had confirmed something he already knew. After dinner, I carried the empty containers into the kitchen while Noah quietly disappeared into the guest room. A few minutes later, I realized I had forgotten to ask him something and walked toward the room. The door was slightly open. Inside, his suitcase lay on the bed with several neatly folded envelopes beside it. One of them clearly had my name written across the front. Before I could read anything else, Noah gently closed the notebook he had been writing in and looked up with a calm expression. I was hoping you would not see those yet. His voice carried no anger, only quiet understanding. Embarrassed, I stepped back immediately. I was not trying to snoop. I know. He smiled kindly. Some things simply need the right day. I nodded, but my curiosity only grew stronger. Whatever Noah had been preparing had clearly begun long before he knocked on my door Sunday night. The envelopes, the repaired apartment, the memories, the countdown on the whiteboard, none of it felt random anymore. Before going to bed, Noah walked into the kitchen carrying the familiar black marker. Beneath day, for he paused longer than usual before carefully writing another sentence. The things we leave behind are sometimes the truest way we tell someone they mattered. He set the marker down and wished me good night, but instead of returning to the guest room, he stood quietly beside the balcony window, watching the lights of the neighborhood flicker beneath the dark sky. I remained in the kitchen staring at the whiteboard, slowly realizing that Noah was not simply spending a week with me. Somehow, in ways I still could not understand, He was carefully preparing me for something that neither of us had yet found the courage to say aloud. Thursday morning arrived with bright sunshine pouring through the apartment windows, making everything feel unusually peaceful. For the first time all week, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the strange feeling that had followed Noah since the night he arrived. He was already in the kitchen humming softly while preparing scrambled eggs and toast, moving around the room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where every plate, every coffee mug, and every spoon belonged. "You are getting far too comfortable in my kitchen," I joked as I grabbed a cup of coffee. He laughed. "You have never complained before. That is because you cook better than I do." The conversation drifted naturally toward old college memories, and for a little while everything felt normal again. Before leaving for work, I noticed Noah standing in front of the whiteboard, studying the previous entries without writing anything new. "You forgot today," I said. He smiled without turning around. "Not yet." Throughout the day, I found it harder than ever to focus. During meetings, I caught myself wondering about the envelopes I had accidentally seen the night before. Every project on my computer seemed less important than the unanswered questions waiting back at the apartment. By late afternoon, I gave up pretending to concentrate and headed home earlier than usual. The apartment was silent when I walked inside. Noah had left a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I went to pick up dinner. Back soon." For the first time all week, I found myself completely alone in the apartment. I walked toward the guest room almost without thinking. The suitcase remained neatly packed on the bed. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly looking away, telling myself I had no right to invade my best friend's privacy. As I turned back toward the kitchen, I opened a cabinet searching for coffee filters. Instead, my eyes landed on a plain white envelope resting beside the coffee canister. My name was written across the front in Noah's familiar handwriting. "Ethan." I froze. It was different from the envelopes I had glimpsed the night before. This one had clearly been left where I would eventually find it. Beneath it lay a folded airline itinerary. My heart began beating faster as I unfolded the paper. Noah Brooks, Portland to Boston. One way. Departure, Sunday, 6:45 p.m. My eyes moved to another document beneath it. It was an employment agreement from an architectural design firm in Boston with a starting date only 2 days after the flight. I read the first page twice before carefully placing everything back exactly as I had found it. A few moments later, I heard the front door unlock. Noah stepped inside, carrying 2 paper bags filled with groceries and takeout containers. "You are home early," he said with an easy smile. "Slow afternoon," I answered, trying to sound normal. For a brief moment, I wondered if he could somehow tell I had seen the documents. If he noticed anything unusual, he never mentioned it. We ate dinner on the balcony while the evening sky slowly turned shades of orange and deep blue. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind all afternoon. "Have you ever thought about moving across the country?" Noah looked toward the horizon before answering. "Sometimes life asks you to choose between staying somewhere comfortable and following the path you know you need to take. Would you leave even if it meant leaving someone important behind?" I asked quietly. He smiled sadly without looking at me. "Sometimes leaving is the only way to stop hiding." His answer settled heavily between us. After we finished dinner, Noah carried the empty coffee mugs into the kitchen and picked up the black marker once more. Beneath day 5, he carefully wrote another sentence in slow, deliberate letters. "The truth becomes heavier every day it remains unspoken." I stood silently reading those words while Noah quietly looked out the kitchen window into the dark evening. And deep inside, I realized that whatever waited at the end of this week had already begun changing both of our lives long before either of us was ready to admit it. Friday arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation that neither of us tried to acknowledge. The apartment felt unusually peaceful, almost as though it understood that only 2 days remained before whatever Noah had been preparing would finally reach its ending. I found him sitting alone on the balcony before sunrise, a steaming mug of coffee resting between his hands while the first light spread across the rooftops. He looked up as I stepped outside and smiled with the same calm expression that had greeted me every morning that week. "You are awake early," I said. He nodded toward the horizon. I did not want to miss another sunrise. His answer caught me off guard. "You make it sound like you have been keeping track." He gave a soft laugh. "Maybe I have." We sat together in comfortable silence until it was time for me to leave for work, but all day long his words stayed with me. I had never known Noah to speak so carefully, as though every sentence carried a meaning hidden beneath the one he actually said. By the time I arrived home that evening, rain had begun falling again, tapping gently against the apartment windows. Noah had already prepared dinner, and the familiar smell of tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches filled the kitchen. It reminded me of college, when those simple meals had somehow made difficult weeks feel manageable. We ate quietly at first before I finally looked across the table and asked the question that had been growing inside me for days. Why Boston? Noah stopped stirring his soup. He looked at the bowl for several long seconds before answering. Because an opportunity came along that I could not ignore. You never told me you were even applying. I almost did. Then why did you not? He sighed softly and rested both hands around his coffee mug. Because I was afraid that if I started talking about leaving, I would lose the courage to go. His honesty only created more questions. You have never hidden important things from me before. Noah met my eyes with quiet sincerity. I know. The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily while the kitchen clock marked each passing second with a gentle ticking sound. Finally, I spoke again. This week has not been about finding a place to stay, has it? Noah slowly shook his head. No, then what has it been about? He closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. About making sure I did not spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had found the courage to be honest. My heartbeat quickened. Honest about what? For a moment, I thought he was finally going to answer. Instead, he smiled sadly. Tomorrow. I leaned back in my chair, unable to hide my frustration. You keep saying tomorrow. Because tomorrow is the day I promised myself I would stop running away. He stood, carried both empty bowls to the sink, and quietly washed the dishes while I remained seated, trying to understand everything that had happened since he arrived with that single suitcase. After the kitchen was clean, Noah reached for the familiar black marker once again. Slowly and carefully, he wrote beneath day 6 on the whiteboard. The longest journey is often the distance between what we feel and what we finally choose to say. He placed the marker down and turned toward me with a gentle smile that somehow carried both hope and fear. Thank you for giving me this week, he said quietly. No matter what happens tomorrow, I will always be grateful for it. I wanted to ask another dozen questions, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I simply nodded as he walked toward the guest room. A few moments later, the apartment became completely silent except for the rain outside. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the whiteboard, the countdown, and the words he had written each day, realizing that whatever truth Noah had carried for all these years was now only one sunrise away from changing everything we had ever believed our friendship to be. Saturday morning arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost felt unreal after days of steady rain. Sunlight poured through the apartment windows, illuminating the whiteboard that now displayed 6 handwritten days, each carrying a sentence that suddenly felt connected in ways I had only begun to understand. I found Noah standing on the balcony with 2 mugs of coffee already waiting. He smiled as I stepped outside, but this time there was no trace of hesitation in his eyes. Instead, I saw something quieter. Acceptance. We sat side by side listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood waking up. A lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. Children laughed as they rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Everything around us continued exactly as it always had, yet it felt impossible to believe my own life would still look the same by the end of the day. Noah finally broke the silence. I promised myself I would not leave without telling you the truth. He stood, disappeared into the guest room for a moment, and returned carrying the plain white envelope with my name written across the front. Instead of handing it to me immediately, he held it carefully between both hands. I wrote this months ago, he admitted. At first I thought I would leave it here after I was gone because I did not think I would ever have enough courage to say any of it out loud. He smiled softly before shaking his head. You deserve more than a letter. He placed the envelope on the coffee table, but did not ask me to open it. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes with a calm honesty I had never seen before. Do you remember orientation week at college? He asked. I smiled. You borrowed my notebook because you forgot yours. Noah laughed quietly. I did not forget it. I frowned in confusion. What do you mean? I left it in my dorm room on purpose. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at me. I wanted an excuse to talk to you. My smile slowly disappeared as I searched his face for some sign that he was joking. There was none. He continued speaking before I could respond. I thought you were the kindest person I had ever met before we even became friends. Then we spent 4 years studying together, moving through life together, celebrating every success, surviving every disappointment. And somewhere along the way, I realized my feelings had quietly become something much deeper. My heartbeat echoed inside my chest. Noah's voice remained calm, steady, and sincere. When you moved away for work, I honestly believed the distance would help me let go. I focused on my career. I tried convincing myself that eventually I would stop feeling this way. He smiled with gentle resignation. I never did. I could not find a single word to interrupt him. Every memory from the past week, every repaired cabinet, every old bookstore, every sentence on the whiteboard suddenly seemed to fit together like pieces of a picture I had been unable to see until now. Noah rested one hand lightly on the unopened envelope. The job in Boston is real. I accepted it because I knew I could not keep standing still forever. But before I left, I realized there was one thing I could not carry with me anymore. He took a slow breath. Ethan, I have loved you for years. Not because of this week. Not because something suddenly changed. I loved you through ordinary mornings, long phone calls, birthdays, road trips, bad days, good news, and every quiet moment in between. I never expected anything from you. I never wanted to make our friendship feel complicated. I only wanted you to know the truth before I walked into a different future. Tears gathered in my eyes before I even realized they were there. Noah smiled gently, the same smile he had worn when he first arrived with a single suitcase 6 nights earlier, but now I finally understood the weight it had carried all along. No matter what your answer is, he whispered, thank you for giving me 1 week to stop hiding from the most important truth I have ever known. For several long moments, I could not say a single word. The apartment seemed to fall completely silent, as though even the world outside had paused to let Noah's confession settle between us. I looked at him, searching for the familiar friend I had known for almost 10 years, but somehow I was seeing him for the very first time. Every memory from the past suddenly returned with a different meaning. I remembered the countless late-night phone calls when he somehow knew exactly when I needed someone to listen. I remembered every birthday he never forgot, every apartment he helped me move into without hesitation, every celebration where he stood quietly beside me, happier about my success than his own. I had always believed those moments were simply what best friends did for each other. Now I realized that every act of kindness had been carrying a quiet truth I had never stopped long enough to notice. My eyes drifted toward the unopened letter resting on the coffee table. Slowly, I reached for it and unfolded the carefully written pages inside. Noah watched silently while I read. He had written about our first week in college. The rainy afternoon we wandered across campus because neither of us wanted to return to our dorms yet, and the evening we shared an inexpensive pizza because we had almost no money left before payday. He remembered the smallest details that I had completely forgotten. He even wrote about the day I encouraged him to apply for an internship after he doubted himself, explaining that my confidence in him had quietly changed the direction of his entire life. Near the end of the letter, one sentence made my vision blur with tears. If the happiest version of your future does not include me, I will still be grateful that I was lucky enough to be part of your story. I carefully folded the letter and looked back at him. You carried all of this by yourself? I asked quietly. Noah smiled with gentle honesty. After enough years, it stopped feeling heavy. Loving someone without asking for anything in return teaches you patience. His answer settled deep inside me. I slowly looked around the apartment. The repaired cabinet, the healthy fern, the straightened photographs, the old paperback on the bookshelf, the countdown written across the whiteboard. None of it had been random. Noah had not spent this week preparing to leave a place. He had been leaving behind pieces of himself, hoping that one day I might understand the language he had never found the courage to speak aloud. Suddenly, another realization struck me with surprising force. Every important memory in my own life seemed to include Noah somewhere in the background. Whenever something wonderful happened, he was the first person I wanted to call. Whenever life became overwhelming, he somehow made everything feel manageable simply by listening. Every holiday felt incomplete if we did not find time to meet, even if it was only for coffee. I had never questioned why one person occupied such a permanent place in my everyday life, because it had always felt natural. I took a slow breath, trying to understand feelings I had never allowed myself to examine before. I always believed you were the safest part of my life, I admitted quietly. I never asked myself why every important moment somehow felt better when you were there. Noah remained silent, giving me the same patience he had apparently carried for years. I smiled through tears I no longer tried to hide. I thought I understood what home meant. My voice grew softer. But this week made me realize that home was never just this apartment. It was the person who made every ordinary day feel meaningful. Noah's expression changed, not with certainty, but with cautious hope. Outside, the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the balcony, and I suddenly imagined him boarding a plane the next evening, carrying his suitcase toward a completely different life while I stayed behind pretending nothing had changed. That thought hurt far more than I expected. In that quiet moment, before either of us spoke another word, I finally understood that the fear growing inside my heart was not about losing my best friend. It was about letting the person who had quietly become the center of my life walk away before I had the courage to discover whether my own heart had been trying to tell me the same truth all along. Sunday afternoon arrived more quietly than I ever imagined it would. The sunlight that had filled the apartment all morning slowly drifted across the hardwood floor, stopping beneath the whiteboard that had silently counted every day of Noah's stay. Neither of us spoke for a long time after my last words. We simply sat together, surrounded by familiar furniture that somehow felt different now that nothing important remained hidden between us. Eventually Noah stood and carried his empty coffee mug into the kitchen. When he returned a few minutes later, his suitcase rested beside the front door exactly where it had been. On the night he arrived, seeing it there tightened something deep inside my chest. Noah looked toward the suitcase, then back at me with the same gentle smile that had always made difficult days feel a little easier. "I should leave soon," he said quietly. "I still have a flight to catch." I looked at the clock on the wall before looking back at him. For the first time all week, I realized I did not care what time it was. I only cared that every passing minute brought him closer to walking away. I slowly stood and crossed the living room until only a few steps separated us. "Can I tell you something?" I asked. Noah nodded without speaking. I smiled, though my voice trembled slightly. I have been trying to understand why this week has felt so different. I glanced around the apartment, taking in the repaired cabinet, the bookshelf we had organized together, the healthy fern beside the window, and every small change Noah had quietly made without asking for recognition. At first I thought you were fixing my apartment. I shook my head with a soft laugh. But you were never fixing the apartment. Noah watched me silently. You were reminding me that love can look ordinary. It can look like making breakfast before someone wakes up. It can look like remembering a favorite coffee order, straightening old photographs, or keeping a promise nobody else even remembers. I felt tears gathering again, but this time I did not look away. I kept thinking that I was afraid of losing my best friend. I took one more step toward him. The truth is, I was afraid of losing the person who has quietly become the most important part of my life. Noah's eyes filled with emotion, yet he still said nothing, giving me the same patience he had always given me. I smiled through my tears. I do not know exactly when my feelings changed, because maybe they did not change all at once. Maybe they grew slowly inside all those ordinary moments we shared for years, and I simply never stopped long enough to recognize them. I looked toward the suitcase resting beside the door. If Boston is still the future you want, I will never ask you to give that dream up. Noah lowered his eyes for a moment, before meeting mine again. Then what are you asking? I answered without hesitation. I am asking whether your future still has room for me. For a brief second, the apartment became completely silent before Noah let out the lightest laugh I had heard all week. It carried relief, gratitude, and hope all at once. He gently set the suitcase back against the wall instead of reaching for it. "I was hoping you would ask that," he whispered. We stood together as the afternoon sunlight warmed the room around us, no longer afraid of the truth that had waited so many years to be spoken. Nearly 1 year later, the apartment looked much the same, but life inside it had changed in the best possible way. Every Sunday morning, we still made pancakes together before drinking coffee on the balcony. The little fern had grown large enough to fill the entire corner by the window. The old paperback remained on the bookshelf exactly where Noah had placed it. And beside the refrigerator, the whiteboard still waited. Most days it held grocery lists and reminders, But every anniversary of that unforgettable week, one of us erased everything and carefully wrote two familiar words across the top. Day 1. Because we learned that the strongest love stories do not begin with perfect timing or dramatic moments. They begin when two people finally find the courage to tell the truth they have been carrying in their hearts all along.